There is a very specific moment that happens inside the avoidant, a moment most of them will never describe out loud, never fully admit to themselves, and never give you the satisfaction of witnessing directly. It happens somewhere in the middle of the silence you created, not at the beginning of it, when their defense mechanisms are still convincing them that your quiet is temporary, that you will return to the familiar pattern, that the dynamic they understood and unconsciously depended on is simply pausing rather than ending. It happens later, when the silence keeps going, when the reaching does not resume, when the reality that you have genuinely, completely chosen yourself over the exhausting labor of pursuing someone who kept moving the goalposts, when that reality finally lands with its full weight. In that moment, something shifts inside the avoidant that is one of the most psychologically complex experiences their attachment system knows how to produce. It is not clean. It is not simple. It is not the tidy emotional response of someone processing a straightforward loss. It is a collision, a multi-layered, internally contradictory, deeply uncomfortable collision between their ego, their shame, their longing, their pride, and their completely unprepared emotional system. And at the center of that collision is something they are almost constitutionally unable to sit with comfortably. The recognition that you humbled them, without trying to, without even meaning to, simply by valuing yourself enough to stop. I want to take you inside that experience today, all the way inside it, because I think you deserve to understand exactly what your silence has set in motion on the other side of the distance between you. And I think understanding it is going to give you something more valuable than satisfaction, though I will not pretend that a degree of satisfaction is not entirely warranted here. It is going to give you clarity about what happened, about what is happening now, and about who you have become through the process of arriving at the silence in the first place. Let me start with the embarrassment, because I think it is the emotion that gets least attention in conversations about avoidant psychology, and it is one of the most significant forces driving their behavior in the aftermath of your silence. The avoidant built a very specific relational identity. I have described this before, but I want to go deeper into it today, because the depth matters for understanding where the embarrassment comes from. The avoidant's identity inside a relationship is organized around a private, rarely examined but deeply held belief that they are the one who could take it or leave it, the one for whom the relationship is a choice rather than a need, the one who engages when they feel like engaging, withdraws when the closeness becomes uncomfortable, and maintains throughout a fundamental orientation of being less affected, less dependent, less vulnerable than the person across from them. This belief was never stated outright. It did not need to be. It was communicated in the texture of every interaction, in the withdrawal that happened without explanation, in the warmth that was offered and then retracted, in the implicit message that their availability was a gift that could be given or withheld at will. And for as long as you were reaching, for as long as your need for connection was more visible than theirs, the belief held. The identity remained intact. The avoidant could look at the dynamic and see confirmation of their own narrative everywhere they looked. Then your silence dismantled the entire thing, not with an argument, not with an ultimatum, not with the kind of confrontation that would have allowed the avoidant to engage their well-rehearsed mechanisms of deflection and detachment, just with silence, with the simple, clean withdrawal of your energy from a dynamic that was not honoring you. And suddenly, the narrative has no evidence to rest on. Suddenly, the person who was supposed to be the more affected party is the one who stopped reaching. Suddenly, the avoidant, who organized their entire relational identity around being the less needy one, is the one sitting with an uncomfortable awareness of absence that feels remarkably, undeniably, humiliatingly like need. That is the embarrassment. The private, hot, deeply unwanted recognition that the story they told themselves about the dynamic was not accurate, that they were not the detached, unaffected, sovereign party they believed themselves to be, that they needed you, are perhaps still needing you, in ways their identity never budgeted for. And the embarrassment is made worse, considerably worse, by the fact that you did not make a scene about it. You did not force a confrontation that would have given the embarrassment somewhere to go, some external target to redirect itself toward. You just left, quietly, completely, with a dignity that reflected so much more self-possession than anything they demonstrated throughout the entire dynamic. The embarrassment of being out-dignified by the person you hurt is not a small thing inside the avoidant psychology. It sits, it burns, and it refuses to be easily filed away. Now I want to talk about the anger, because it is real, and I think you need to understand its origins clearly so that you do not make the mistake of interpreting it as evidence that your silence was wrong. The avoidant is angry at you, in most cases genuinely, irrationally, specifically angry at you. And the irrationality of that anger is precisely what makes it so revealing. They are angry because you changed the rules. Not rules you agreed to explicitly, rules the avoidant established unilaterally through their behavior and then unconsciously relied on you to follow indefinitely. The rule that you would always be reachable. The rule that your investment in the connection would remain consistently higher than theirs. The rule that the dynamic would continue to operate in a way that kept their emotional exposure minimal and their sense of relational power intact. Your silence broke every one of those rules simultaneously, and the anger is the avoidant's first, most defensive response to having a structure they depended on, a structure built entirely from your compliance, suddenly and completely removed. I want to be emphatic about something here. The anger is irrational. The avoidant knows this on some level, which is part of why it is so uncomfortable for them to sit with. They cannot justify the anger without exposing the entitlement that underlies it. They cannot explain why your choosing yourself makes them angry without admitting that they expected you not to. And admitting that expectation means admitting a degree of taking you for granted that sits very badly against the self-image of someone who believes they are fair, self-aware, and emotionally sophisticated. So the anger circulates without a clean outlet. It cannot be directed at you openly because there is no legitimate grievance. You simply stopped reaching, which is an entirely sovereign decision that requires no justification. It cannot be fully directed inward because that level of self-confrontation requires more psychological readiness than the avoidant currently possesses. It sits in the middle, hot and uncomfortable and vaguely humiliating, another piece of internal evidence that the silence has destabilized something much deeper than they were prepared for. Underneath the embarrassment and the anger, and this is the layer that matters most for your understanding of what your silence has actually accomplished, is something considerably more tender, something the avoidant will work very hard to avoid acknowledging, even privately, even alone, even in the quiet moments when the defenses are less vigilant than usual. Grief. Real, specific, surprisingly profound grief for what they had with you and what their patterns cost them. The avoidant's relationship with grief is one of the most complicated aspects of their entire psychological profile, because grief requires the acknowledgement of loss, and loss requires the acknowledgement of value, of having had something that mattered enough that its absence registers as pain. And that acknowledgement for the avoidant is a direct confrontation with everything their self-sufficiency narrative was built to deny. That they valued you, that they needed the connection, that the thing they walked away from, or allowed to collapse through the slow, steady drip of withdrawal and unavailability, was not a casual option they could replace without consequence, but something genuinely, specifically irreplaceable. Your silence forces that grief to the surface, not because silence is a manipulation designed to provoke it. I want to be clear about that distinction. But because silence removes the distractions that were allowing the avoidant to avoid it. As long as you were reaching, the avoidant could focus on managing the dynamic, on calibrating how much distance to maintain, on the low-level but constant background activity of monitoring your emotional state and positioning themselves in relation to it. Your silence ends all of that activity. There is nothing to manage, nothing to calibrate, nothing to monitor. There is only the absence where you used to be. And in that absence, with nothing left to do and nothing left to manage, the grief finds its way forward. I want to talk now about what the avoidant does with all of this, with the embarrassment, the anger, the grief, the destabilizing recognition that they need you in ways they were not prepared to need you. Because the response is predictable, and I think understanding it will help you navigate whatever comes next with a clarity that serves you. The avoidant's first response is almost always to double down on the distance. This is counterintuitive but psychologically consistent. When the avoidant's internal state becomes overwhelming, when the emotion is too loud, too present, too insistent to comfortably suppress, the instinct is to create more of the thing that has historically provided temporary relief. More distance, more self-sufficiency, more of the external architecture of not needing. This can look, from the outside, like they have moved on, like your silence produced nothing, like they are fine, functioning, indifferent to the absence of your energy in their life. I want you to understand that this appearance is one of the most unreliable surfaces in all of human behavior. The doubling down on distance is not the behavior of someone who feels nothing. It is the behavior of someone who feels too much and has only one tool available for managing it. The avoidant who is doubling down on distance is in the most active, most effortful, most psychologically costly phase of their response to your silence. They are working hard to maintain a composure that the internal landscape is doing everything in its power to undermine. The second response, which often follows the first after an interval that varies depending on the individual avoidant and the specific depth of what existed between you, is a period of what I would describe as involuntary reflection. The defenses, however strong, are not infinitely sustainable against a genuine loss, and the avoidant begins, usually in the quietest and least protected moments, early morning, late at night, in the middle of tasks that do not fully occupy the mind, to think about you with an honesty that the defended hours do not permit. They think about specific moments, the texture of particular conversations, the way you made them feel in the periods when the walls were down and the connection was real and unguarded. They think about the things you did that nobody else has done, the ways you saw them that nobody else has seen, the particular quality of being known by you that they have been pretending was not as significant as it was. And they think about what they did with all of that, what their patterns cost, what the withdrawal, the unavailability, the cycling of closeness and distance ultimately produced. Not in an abstract, theoretical way, but in the visceral, unavoidable way of someone who is holding the consequence of their behavior in their hands and finding it considerably heavier than they anticipated. This is the humbling. Not a performance of humility, not a calculated display designed to draw you back, but the genuine, private, often silent experience of being brought low by the weight of their own choices and their own losses. Now I want to speak to you directly, because I have spent a significant portion of this conversation inside the avoidance experience, and I do not want to leave you there with them. I want to bring you back to yourself, to what your silence means for you, independent of what it is producing in them. Your silence was not a weapon. I know some people will frame it that way, as a power move, as the strategic withdrawal of attention designed to trigger exactly the response I have been describing. And perhaps for some people it begins that way. But the silence I am talking about, the one that genuinely humbles an avoidant, the one that produces the embarrassment and the anger and the grief and the involuntary reflection, that silence does not come from strategy. It comes from exhaustion, from the bone-deep tiredness of someone who has been giving everything to a dynamic that was taking everything. From the moment of absolute clarity when the cost of continuing finally and irrevocably outweighs the hope of what the continuing might eventually produce. That moment is not a tactic. It is a turning point. It is the moment you stopped organizing your life around their unavailability and started organizing it around your own worth. And what your silence says, to them, to the world, and most importantly to yourself, is something that no argument or ultimatum or confrontation could ever have communicated with the same force. It says that you know your value, not as a concept, not as an affirmation you repeat until you believe it, as a lived, embodied, non-negotiable reality that you are no longer willing to compromise for the comfort of someone who was not willing to meet you fully. The avoidant is embarrassed and angry and quietly, privately humbled by your silence. And somewhere underneath all of that, in the most honest and unguarded corner of their interior world, they are also doing something that I think will surprise you. They are respecting you. More than they have respected anyone in a very long time. Perhaps more than they knew they were capable of respecting someone in the context of a romantic connection. because the avoidant respects self-possession above almost every other quality. It is, after all, the quality they have organized their entire identity around, and you have just demonstrated it with a completeness and a consistency that exceeds anything they managed throughout the entire dynamic between you. They withdrew with noise, with the indirect noise of mixed signals and hot and cold, and walls that went up and came down and went up again. You withdrew with silence, clean, complete, and utterly self-assured. That is not something they will forget. That is not something they will easily replace. And that is not something that leaves the avoidant's internal world unchanged, however unchanged their external behavior might appear. You did not fight back. You did not chase. You did not make your pain into a weapon or your need into a plea. You simply, completely, with the full authority of someone who finally knows what they are worth, stopped. And in that stopping, you said everything that needed to be said, more eloquently, more powerfully, and more permanently than words could ever have managed.